Why do I have a bone to pick with nihilism? In previous videos, I've criticized nihilism and promoted existentialism instead. And in one of my latest videos, um, where I was talking about the idea that for me, existentialism is better understood as a rejection rather than as a set of assertion, one person commented that they didn't see any problem with nihilism in itself. And I mean, I can kind of see their point of view, and I think there's like some um, like it makes sense, but there's kind of different angles to it, and so I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into why I have some contentions with nihilism. First, let's just do a quick definition. So, according to Wikipedia, I'm just using this source so that we all agree and that I'm just not making up my own definition. So, according to Wikipedia, it's a viewpoint that says that life is inherently meaningless and lacks a higher purpose. Another way to think about this is that there's basically no absolute and reliable source of meaning and purpose that we can kind of rely on to guide us. There's technically several forms of nihilism. Nihilism is kind of a philosophical stance of rejecting or denying the underlying and absolute truths and existence of different types of things. So in this case, we're focusing more on existential nihilism, which rejects the existence of meaning and purpose. But there's different types of nihilism. There are nihilism on morality, that there is no true moral fact. There's nothing that it's all an illusion. Same for reality, and there's like some forms of nihilism that reject that there are any like reality is real. Anyways, in this video we'll just be focusing on the existential branch of nihilism. And so to quote Wikipedia again, it says, "This view suggests that it is not possible to live a genuinely meaningful life, that there is no higher reason to continue living, and that all efforts, achievements, happiness, and suffering are ultimately pointless." Now, in practice, I think that existential nihilism tends to bleed into moral nihilism, so that there's no true morality. It's just kind of an illusion. In the same way that there is no true meaning, people can find some fleeting meaning, but it's just kind of made up in their head. There's no external, real, true, tangible meaning, and same thing for morality. So I think in practice they kind of tend to blend into one another, because there's kind of this implication in existential nihilism that it's like a rejection of value and the hierarchization of value. Basically, that the idea that something is more or less meaningful and important than something else. Nihilism kind of rejects all of that, and so if you kind of get rid of value, you get rid of a lot of morality. That something is better than something else, at least on a moral or on value, not necessarily just on a practical level, because you could say something is better suited for the type of task than something else, but just on a more I don't know, spiritual or what you should do, then this is kind of a rejection of values on this front. And in this way, existential nihilism shares a lot of ties with absurdism, which is another slightly different philosophical viewpoint that says that trying to find meaning leads people into conflict with a seemingly meaningless world. So it's somewhat existentially nihilistic, although it might have a little bit more of a skeptical nature, because at least in my view, and different people will have kind of a bit of a different perspective on each of these theories, or at least they kind of perceive them a specific way. So that's kind of what can create some misunderstandings when we kind of put different things behind those different words. But I think that absurdism is more like we can't find the tangible meaning, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist, or rather that it's unreachable. And in this way, I find it to be closer to skepticism or philosophical skepticism. That doesn't say that there is no truth, but that if truth does exist, we can't really secure it. So that's a little bit different. And so to now address my personal take and issues with nihilism, I don't really necessarily disagree with the weaker, more skeptical version that says that, we can't find any tangible, reliable, absolute, or external or objective source of meaning and purpose. I would rather tend to agree with that. And even, even the stance or the viewpoint that there is none at all is, it's a fine statement, or it's a fine viewpoint. Theoretically, it's not proven, but like it in itself, it makes sense. So I don't really have an issue with the idea, we'll say. But I have two issues with applied nihilism, we'll say, because the first is that for me it's impossible to live as a consistent nihilist. Now, that might not be an issue for everybody. Some people might not care as much about consistency than I do, but that's my first issue with it. And then the second is that usually when people embrace nihilism, it usually leads to bad outcomes, both for themselves and for the people around them. Let's start with consistency. So I think there's kind of a what I'd call a praxis contradiction in nihilism. And the way I would describe a praxis contradiction is it's a theory, or like a set of beliefs or way of seeing the world, where if you act the fact of acting them out basically contradicts the theory. That's maybe not very clear, but I'll explain with nihilism. For me, consistent nihilism, so the rejection of all meaning, and so with it, value, that something is more valuable than another, is kind of the antithesis of life, because life is predicted on preferences. If you don't, and I've talked about this in other places, but I don't know where I published it. Anyway, I'll just go over it again. Life is predicated on preference, and the main one being to stay alive and to keep living. Because if you didn't have this drive, well, you just end up dying. I mean, you can die either way, and so life doesn't perpetuate itself. So life already has a bias, and that it wants to keep living, right? And there's a lot of other drives that come with life, like reproduction, depending on the type of organism, to consume some types of nutrition versus others, and to favor some behaviors over others, usually always within that main goal of to keeping alive, right? And so in there is a value, and there's a value hierarchy, which depends on the type of organism or animal, etc. And you might say it's not absolute, but you're acting out when you're alive as if some things are more important than others, or some things are more now, I mean, to an extent you might nitpick how following needs or certain drives is exactly the same as implying that there is meaning in them. But for me, the only true consistent nihilist are corpses and minerals, or inorganic material, like a rock, in that they have no preferences whatsoever, and they don't assign value, at least as far as we can tell, to anything. There's no discrimination. I think a good quote that represents this idea can be found in Vinland Saga, at least the anime. I don't know the manga version of this quote. I slightly edited to avoid potential spoilers, but it goes: "There, he is dead, and therefore more beautiful than anyone alive. You might say that he is love itself, for you see he will no longer hate, nor will he steal. His body will be abandoned here, and his flesh will feed both beasts and insects alike. He will be blown about by the wind and pelted by the wind and pelted by the rain, and he will not raise a single word in complaint. It is death that completes a man." You are saying that the essence of love is death? Yes. Then the emotion a father feels for his child, what a husband and a wife feel for each other, what is that? Discrimination. It is hardly different from the way one swears fealty to a king or whips a slave. To your father, your life was more important than anyone else's, more important than even his own, I suspect. His tender feelings towards you were discrimination. So I really like this this moment in Vinland Saga. I'd recommend watching it. But I think it kind of illustrates well what I'm talking about with this idea of this contradiction. Because if you live your life, we have just basic needs of like eating, sleeping. But even outside of that, I guess you could just stay alive. But even within that, you'll still there's some stuff you like over others, and so you can't really act consistently, like truly consistently, with the theoretical idea that there's no value in anything. I mean, you could say that it's all subjective and absurd, but I do feel there's still quite a contradiction that'd be going on at all times. And personally, I don't like that. I'd be very irked to act in contradiction to my theoretical understanding of the world. In the same way, for me, the same thing it happens in the debate between free will and determinism, where although I would agree that when it comes to empirical evidence, determinism is strongly favored, or at least the empirical evidence seems to strongly favor the hypothesis of determinism. If you're a determinist, you will still live your life as if you have free will, just because it seems to be like an inborn or like a natural human lens of going through life. And so this constant like splinter or difference in between the way you conceive of reality on kind of this philosophical level and the way you act, for me that's very annoying. Like that's a big problem. I don't like it at all. I mean, I guess you could say that just because it feels like there's an inconsistency doesn't mean you shouldn't believe something if it's the truth, so to speak. But yeah, that's one first problem I have with it, is that you'll usually see that people that buy into nihilism still have some bias, some preferences, and they're not truly they don't seem to truly buy it themselves. And then my other issue with it is how nihilism tends to look like when it's embodied. What people, at least humans, how people tend to act under a nihilistic framework. Because I think there's like the pure philosophical stance, so to speak, but then there's how it actually plays out in real life. And the way usually that people, like when we refer to nihilism as an action or as a stance on life, it's usually associated with a set of behaviors. And so I don't really think that nihilism, when it's embodied or applied, is a true commitment to the absence of value in anything, but rather it tends to kind of devolve into cynicism and selfishness. The stance could be kind of summarized in the idea that nothing is sacred, so I can do whatever I want, nothing matters, and I have license to be an absolute selfish dirtbag. So I guess there's kind of two options, right? So some people will just get deeply depressed and basically lose drive to do much, and so in this way it's just harming themselves. Then for others, they'll just be selfish, cynical, antisocial hedonists, right? So because nothing really matters, it just kind of follows their drives or what brings fleeting pleasure, and it's fine if they act in mean ways or they harm other people because nothing really matters. There's nothing sacred, so there is no reason to limit your behavior. Nothing really matters, and so they still continue living just for the fleeting pleasures or because it's like a drive, but there's nothing really more going on. So that's pretty. I don't think that's a very fulfilling way to live for most people, at least. It's not very pleasant for yourself. It's probably not very good for the people around you because, well, it depends. If you're depressed, you're mostly harming yourself, although it might affect the people that care about you. And then if you're being selfish and cynical, you're probably going to be harming other people around you. And I think that this behavior doesn't it's not really a logical conclusion. It doesn't follow logically from the premise that nothing matters. Nothing matters, so it's fine to be selfish. It doesn't make more sense than saying nothing matters. Therefore, I should be extra nice with everyone. So that's kind of one thing I have an issue with. Like it doesn't, from the idea that nothing matters, nothing has more value, you can derive any like like it's impossible to play that out technically consistently. Or I guess you could do act in a completely random way, or I don't know. Like it's a, you can't really derive a a prescriptive stance from that premise, and it gives you no basis to hierarchize or to prefer one behavior over another or one set of preference over another. So like everything is equally absurd given this framework. Selfishness, just as much as altruism, are both equally absurd and meaningless. If you did, and by discriminating and by having preference, they're making kind of an implicit statement of value, even if it's moderate. And I think that basically embodied nihilism is not really like a rational philosophical stance. It's more of an emotional reaction. And well, it kind of depends because there's like more than one case figure. But I think in many cases it's more of a sour grapes reaction, right? Like people that are suffering and disenfranchised because they can't really find some deeper meaning, which they would want. So that's kind of the whole condition of absurdism, right? This kind of frustration from longing for meaning but having a hard time finding it out there. And so because they're kind of in this depressed and bleak bad space, they kind of just want to vindicate their suffering by defiling other people's sense of meaning and beauty, and potentially, as they go about it, or repressing some remnants of hope that maybe they'll be proven wrong at some point, and through that find some salvation, because then they'll have found something that's meaningful, at least at that point in time. But I think for other people, it's also like an excuse to justify antisocial behavior. So like some people that tend to be very predatory, like very like completely sociopathic or stuff like that, tend to have a nihilistic point of view. And then there's kind of this, kind of might mix right and sort of law of the jungle viewpoint. So it's kind of a way of making it make sense to an extent. But I don't really think, like I personally don't really value this embodied philosophical stance as as something that's good or that makes sense. And I think that at the end of the day, you kind of have like whichever stance you take as a reaction to the fleetingness of meaning and in life, and kind of all the ways we can struggle with it. Any way you decide to react is a choice. There's no one that's superior or that makes more sense. And so in the same way that optimism and existentialism isn't like a given, it doesn't like, it's not the one best on a like rational or logical level reaction. It's a choice you can take, but it's the exact same with, like the attitude of nihilism or basically cynicism. I think that a lot of cynics like to kind of portray their way of seeing the world as one that makes the most sense, right? If you're a lucid thinker, you're looking at reality without fooling yourself, then naturally you become a cynic, right? That's like that's the truth, and it's bitter and bleak, but that's what when you're being really honest, that's what the truth is. But I don't think that's true. It's like it's a choice. You're looking at the same reality through a different lens, and you're just about choosing which lens you want to use. So I think personally that a cautious and reasonable form of optimism and existentialism is the better lens, because it leads to a better subjective experience for yourself and for others. Now, I can't make an absolute justification for the fact that subjective experience or the subjective experience of people matters. Although you could say that nihilists kind of do too, but just in a more self-centered way. However, I still hold that belief firmly, and I think most people kind of give some value to a subjective experience that tends to be the foundation for a lot of moral claims, or a foundation for morality in general, at least human morality. And so yeah, that's my general take as why I'm not a big fan of nihilism and why I support existentialism. I also tend to be puzzled by people that are cheerful, self-described nihilist or absurdist. I've seen this a couple of times, where some people will, say like, "Oh, I'm a nihilist," or "I'm an absurdist," with a big smile. Like for me, that's like a pretty bleak and depressing viewpoint. So it's weird to say it with like this kind of mirth. So usually when people kind of say like, "Oh yeah, there's no meaning and all," but somehow I can still keep a drive to live, but you can still kind of make up your own meaning or kind of assign meaning yourself. Then I don't think you're a pure nihilist or absurdist, right? It's kind of part of, it's like a premise of your philosophical stance, but you've gone further, and probably you're probably embodying a form of existentialism, which in itself is an acknowledgement and a reaction to absurdism. It doesn't say like, "Oh, we shouldn't take it seriously." It says, "Oh yeah, that's a thing, but how do you react?" And so if you're finding some meaning or some reason, to keep living, in spite of acknowledging that nihilism and absurdism are some real weighty ideas that should be acknowledged, or you should think about it, you've probably gone beyond. You're probably not just a nihilist or an absurdist, or maybe you just have a really unique mind where you find joy and peace in the lack of absolute meaning. But yeah, I don't. That's just something that I tend to find puzzling. So probably, in this type of cases, I think these people are actually existentialists, and you can probably just say that because in being an existentialist, you are already bundling in the absurdism. But whatever, that's just a little nitpick. So I hope this was interesting, or you could give a bit more clarification on my thought process. If you're interested, you can check out the video to which this is kind of a follow-up, which was called "Can You Find Meaning and Purpose Despite a Skeptical Nature?" And it was kind of making the case that for me, existentialism is more a rejection, like a stance of rejection to certain type of philosophies than a set of claims itself. Don't hesitate to ask questions in the comment. As you can see, this can kind of spark inspiration for other videos, or to just kind of flesh out more a specific topic or idea. In any case, thanks for listening, and yeah, see you in the next vlog.